Hi, I want to make a video here that addresses what's called the 400-year problem in the Bible. And this deals with the amount of time that the Egyptians were in Egypt before the Exodus. Now, a lot of people think, well, they were in Egypt for 400 years, and then Moses let them out through the Red Sea. And first of all, before I go into that, if you want to find information on my videos and other topics that I discuss, you can find that at grailoftruth.com. Spelled Grail of truth.com, Grail of Truth. So anyways, back to the subject at hand here. How long were the Israelites actually in Egypt? Now, theologians have debated this for a long time, and they've come up with a couple different answers in apologetics as to how long this time period would be. The reason why there would seem to be a contradiction is because several verses in the Bible, on the face of it, would seem to not coincide with each other as to that amount of time. For example, in Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 through 16, it gives us a time period of 400 years. And that's also referred to in Acts chapter 7, verses 6 through 7. But if we look at Exodus chapter 12, verses 40 through 41, we get a period of 430 years. Well, that doesn't seem to coincide with 400 years. That 430-year period is also referred to in Galatians chapter 3, verses 15 through 17. But then if we look at Acts chapter 13, verses 16 through 21, we seem to have a time period of 450 years that refers to that time. So none of those dates seem to coincide with each other. So apologetics and theologians have tried to, apologists and theologians have tried to come up with a way to reconcile those dates to find out exactly how long were the Israelites in Egypt. The problem is that none of these dates actually refers to the amount of time that they were actually in Egypt proper. And the solutions that they've given so far are also not correct, and I'll show you why in a moment. First of all, there's an additional time period that we have to look at here, and that's the forefathers of Moses who led the Israelites out of Egypt. In Exodus chapter 6, verses 16 through 20, it tells us the generations of Moses and Aaron, his brother. It says that Levi lived age 137. Levi had Kohath, who lived age 133. Kohath had Amram, who lived age 137. And then Amram had Aaron and Moses. Aaron was the elder. He was 83. Moses was 80 at the time of the Exodus. So that seems like enough time, except for one problem. Genesis chapter 46, verse 11, says that Kohath was the son of Levi, was one of the individuals who went with Jacob into Egypt. So therefore, the time in Egypt cannot start before the time of Kohath. Now, Kohath might have been a baby at that point in time, so it could have been in his first year, but you cannot go earlier than Kohath. So if we take the age of Kohath at 133, we add his son at 137, and then we add Moses at the time of the Exodus as 80, that gives us a total time frame maximum of 350 years. Well, if they could only be in Egypt at a maximum of 350 years, how is it then possible that we have 400, 430, or 450 years? Well, it's not, obviously. One of those, it would seem to be an error, but I'll show you why they're not. Now, first of all, let me give you what the theologians have offered for solutions. One is to say that they were actually in Egypt for 430 years, but only 400 of those years were they in affliction. And the reason is because the prophecy given in Genesis 15 says that they would be afflicted for 400 years, and that they would be a stranger in a land that's not theirs. However, Exodus chapter 12, verse 40 and 41 says that they came out of Egypt 430 years later, even that self-same day. Well, the idea being that Joseph was the second in command in Egypt at the time that Israel, Jacob, and his sons came to Egypt to live, and so therefore the first 30 years or so was not a time of affliction because Joseph was helping run things, and then it wasn't until after that point that the affliction started and they were made slaves and so forth. Problem with that is Joseph lived to age 110, and Joseph was 39 when Jacob came with his sons to live in Egypt. So there's a lot longer time, 30 years for when Joseph actually died. And it says that the Pharaoh basically that afflicted the sons of Egypt, he came into power. He was a Pharaoh that knew not Joseph. He came into power after Joseph, and that whole generation died. So if he came into power after Joseph and that whole generation died, and he's the one that afflicted the Israelites, then it had to be a lot longer than 30 years before the quote-unquote affliction started. So that 430-year idea doesn't really work. Plus, it still doesn't work with the 350 years given in Exodus chapter 6. So we know that one does not solve the problem. The second idea that's given is that to say that they were actually in Egypt for 215 years, and then 215 years before that, Abraham's son Isaac was supposedly teased by an Egyptian, and then that's when the affliction started. Well, the problem is that Galatians chapter 3, verses 15 through 17 says that the covenant was confirmed 430 years before the law was given, and the law we know was given on Mount Sinai at the time of the Exodus. So therefore, supposedly this teasing by the Egyptian would start the affliction somehow confirmed the covenant. And that doesn't really make a lot of sense either. What would that have to do with confirming the covenant? So that one doesn't really seem to work, even though at least 215 years would fall within our 350-year max. Again, neither of those two solutions are correct. I'm going to give you the correct solution now. First of all, we have to look at the prophecy given for the 400 years, which is the 400 years of affliction. And that's found in Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 through 6. And I'm going to go ahead and read that to you now. So let me grab my Bible here. Oops. So we go to Genesis. Genesis chapter 15. And you can grab your Bible if you want and read along. Verses 13 start, and it says, and he said unto Abraham, God speaking here, and he said unto Abraham, know of a surety that thy seed will be a stranger in a land that's not theirs, and he shall serve them, and they shall be afflicted and it shall afflict them for 400 years. That's the start of the affliction. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward they shall come out with great substance. And then thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, and shall be buried in good old age. So Abraham's going to die. But then in the fourth generation they'll come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet fulfilled. And the Amorites are living in Canaan. They're among the Canaanites. And when the Israelites came out of Egypt after the Exodus, they conquered the Canaanites and the Amorites, and that was when they were judged. But their iniquity would not happen until after the Exodus, or wouldn't be fulfilled until after the Exodus. So anyways, so we know the affliction starts at some point here, but look at the points of this prophecy. First of all, it says they're going to be a seed, that Abraham's seed would be a stranger in a land that's not theirs. And it says that they would be in bondage. It says that they would be afflicted for 400 years. They'd also be a stranger for 400 years in a land that's not theirs. Then the nation that puts them into bondage, that afflicts them, God's going to judge that nation. That they'll come out with great substance. And then at some point during this process, Abraham's going to die. But then in the fourth generation, they're going to come back again because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet fulfilled. Okay, let's look at a couple points here. And this is the point that I don't know why people have missed it throughout all the years, because it's right in front of us. Maybe God blinded people's eyes on purpose all this time. I don't know. But if we look at the language here, wherever they're coming out of, they're coming out with great stuff. But then in the fourth generation, they're coming hither or coming back. So most theologians and apologetics think that these two events are the same thing. But if you look at the language, that's not really what it's saying. They're coming out of somewhere with great substance, and 4 generations later, they're coming back from somewhere. So they went out, disappeared for 4 generations, and then came back. Where are they coming back to? They're coming back to the land of Canaan, in order to judge the Amorites. So wherever they came out of had to have been before they went into Egypt. Now the reason why they think that coming out actually means the time in Egypt is because they take the second point here, which means that they'll be in bondage, to refer to their time in Egypt. Well, they weren't in bondage the entire time they were in Egypt. Joseph was in power for a great deal of time. He was second in command under Pharaoh. And so, yes, they were in bondage and became slaves during a part of their time in Egypt, but that doesn't necessarily seem to make sense with that entire prophecy if you really think about it. So therefore, was there any nation that Jacob or Israel was in bondage to before he went into Egypt? And I'll show you here what that was. When Jacob was 77 years old, he was fleeing. He had to flee from his brother Esau because Esau was going to try to kill him. And he went into Haran, which is near Ur the Chaldees in the Babylonian area, in order to get a wife. And he got it from his own kin because his parents didn't want him to take him a wife from the woman of the Canaanites. So he goes to the house of Laban in Haran, And this is the same area that Abraham dwelt before Abraham came out into the land of Canaan, because God called Abraham out of Ur of Chaldees, out of Haran, to go into Canaan so that his seed would possess that land. Well, this area, Haran and Ur of the Chaldees, this is Babylon. So the area that Abraham came out of was Babylon in order to inherit the land. That's the original promise. The original thing that God did was call Abraham out of Babylon so that his seed would inherit the land of Canaan. Okay, so Jacob goes to the house of Laban back in Haran, in Haran, and makes an agreement with Laban in order to get Rachel, his daughter, to be his wife. He makes an agreement with Laban to work for him for 7 years. This is the start of the bondage. Jacob agreed to be Laban's slave in order to get Rachel as a wife. However, Laban tricked him. Laban ended up giving him his firstborn daughter, Leah, and apparently, there's no lights back in those days, and it's pitch black, and on the wedding night, Jacob didn't know that Leah was not Rachel, and he didn't find out till morning. And then in the morning, he confronted Laban after he consummated the marriage, and Laban said, well, it's not our custom to give away the firstborn daughter after the secondborn daughter. You got to take the firstborn daughter first, but don't worry, work for me another 7 years, and I'll give you Rachel as well. So Laban tricked Jacob into working not 7 years, but 14 years, and Jacob had to have 2 wives. Now, if you don't think that's going to create affliction, just look at the chapters after that talk about how Leah and Rachel are basically struggling against each other. This created all kinds of havoc and affliction for the family of Jacob, who is the nation of Israel. So if you look at Genesis chapter 29, verse 32, when Jacob has his firstborn son, this is the first year he's working in for Laban. Let me go there real quick. You can get the confirmation that this has to be the start of the affliction. So let's go to chapter 29, and this is verse 32. And Leah conceived, and she bare a son, and she called his name Reuben. This is Jacob's firstborn son. And she said, for surely the Lord hath looked upon my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. And then she conceived again, she bare another son, and says, because the Lord hath heard that I was hated, and therefore he's given me another son. And she called his name Simeon, and so on and so forth. So there's affliction going on here. Not only are they slaves to Laban, not only with their family. I mean, Jacob loved Rachel, but then he's given the other wife, Leah, that he has to fulfill. I mean, this created all kinds of problems. Believe me, this was a start of great affliction for Jacob. So the affliction in the prophecy of the 400 years starts when Jacob is age 77. Okay? Jacob does not go with his sons to live in Egypt until he's age 130. And I'll get to that in a moment. Now, what about the 430 years? Well, if Jacob is 77 and goes to live in Egypt to 430, does the 430 years start at that point as well? That doesn't really work out either, because there's only 400 years of affliction, so you can't start the 430 years at that point. Well, let's go take a look at the 430 years. First of all, we're going to go to Exodus 12:40, verse 41. So let me go to Exodus chapter 12. Verse 40. Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years, and it came to pass at the end of 430 years, even that self-same day, it came to pass that the host of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. Now it says the children of Israel. The word children there is beni, which is bet, nun, and a yod in Hebrew. This can also mean the people of Israel or the nation of Israel. But it mostly is transferred as sons because the word ben, which is the root word, means sons of Israel. But it could be referring to Jacob himself or the nation of Israel, because Jacob is the nation of Israel. When Jacob was born, that was the birth of Israel. He is the seed that will inherit the land. Christ is the ultimate promised seed, but Jacob's the seed that will inherit the land. So anyways, so when Israel was born is when the covenant was confirmed. Because prior to that point in time, when you confirm a covenant, you make it firm. You set it in stone. It becomes unchangeable at that point in time. Prior to that time, it could have been changed. Now, when Isaac was born, you still had the coming of Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau both could have argued to be heirs, but Esau didn't sell his birthright to Jacob until later. And the promise when Jacob was born is that God was going to make a great nation out of Jacob. So the covenant did not become confirmed or made firm and unchangeable during the time of Isaac. So it couldn't have been the 215-year idea that goes all the way back to the time of Isaac. The covenant had to have been confirmed when Jacob was born, because at that point in time, now Jacob is the nation of Israel. There are no other potential descendants. There's no Ishmaels, there's no Esau's. Jacob is the one who became Israel. Jacob is the one that was promised to get the land and be made a great nation. He is the confirmation of the covenant. So if we look at when Jacob entered into Israel, and this is at when he's age 130, so let me go there. And this is chapter 47, verse 8, starting at verse 8. And Pharaoh said unto Jacob, How old art thou? How old are you? And Jacob said unto Pharaoh, The days and the years of my sojourning, or pilgrimage in some Bibles, are 130 years. Few and evil have been the years of my life, and I have not attained unto the days and the years of the life of my fathers and the days of their pilgrimage. So Jacob has been a sojourner, or a Bedouin, without his own land his entire life. The covenant was confirmed at Jacob's birth, and it says that he was sojourning. The days of his sojourning was 130 years. So according to Exodus chapter 12, verse 40, if the sojourning of Israel was 430 years, and it started at Jacob's birth, and Jacob was 130 when he entered Egypt, that gives us 300 years that the Israelites were in Egypt. Now, does that work within the 350-year time period? Absolutely. In fact, it means that the father, Amram and Kohath, were probably a little bit older than Abraham, but not much when they had their successive generations. So it kind of keeps in line with the generations up until that point. But it was well within the 350-year time span here. It works with the prophecy, and it still allows for the 400 years of affliction. But let's get back to that 400 years of affliction. We have a bit of a problem here. If the 400 years of affliction start when Jacob is age 77, that takes us out to beyond after the Exodus. Let's do the math here. If they're in Egypt 300 years, and Jacob entered in Egypt when he's 130, and the affliction started when he's 77, that means the affliction started 53 years before they entered into Egypt. So we add the 300 to the 53, we're at 353 years of affliction at the time of the Exodus. Well, we're 47 years short. However, the Israelites wandered in the desert, in the wilderness, for 40 years. This whole time, remember, they're still sojourning. They still don't have their land, per the prophecy. But at the end of 40 years, they began the conquest of Canaan, okay? And they started with the city of Jericho. Marched around it 7 times, blew the trumpets, and the last year they blew it 7 times, and then the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. That was the first city that they conquered in their conquest of Canaan. This would have been year 393 of the affliction. They still don't have the land yet. They're conquering the land. How long did the conquering the land take? Well, it took a long time, but after that there was a year of peace. Well, the Jubilee years that they were celebrating at that time, there was a Sabbath year every 7th year. That would have been the year of peace, which means that after they marched around the city of Jericho 7 times, they were starting their 7-year campaign on the conquest of Canaan. And then in the 7th year they had peace. So if they started it at the 393rd year of affliction, that means in the 400th year is when the conquest was completed. And it says at the end of the completion of the conquest in the book of Joshua is when they divvied up the land. And now for the first time, Israel, the nation, finally had their own land. This entire time, from 400 years from the time that the affliction started, just like the prophecy said, they would be a stranger in a land that's not theirs. It wasn't until the end of that 400-year period that Israel finally got the land. So that's where we get the 400-year prophecy. Excuse me. What about Acts chapter 13, verses 16 through 21? Let's take a look at that, because that says 450 years. So let's go to Acts. One moment here. Get lost in my own Bible sometimes. Acts chapter 13. And you can read this along in your own Bible as well. Acts chapter 13, verses 16. Okay, and Paul stood up and beckoned with his hand and said, Men of Israel, and ye that fear God, give audience. The God of the people of Israel chose our fathers and exalted the people when they dwelled as strangers in the land of Egypt, and with an high arm he brought them out of it. And about that time of 40 years suffered he their manners in the wilderness. And when he had destroyed the 7 nations of the land of Canaan, he divided their land to them by a lot. So this is the end of the conquest. And after that he gave unto them judges about a space of 450 years until Samuel the prophet. So the space of 450 years in a lot of Bibles says that this whole time period took about 450 years, and then after that he gave them Samuel the prophet. That's the way it's translated from the original Hebrew. So the question of 450 years before the judges started. Well, the judges started in the 8th year after Joshua died, because the children of Israel, if you read the book of Judges, and this is in, you can read this in Judges chapter 3, verses 7 through 9, it says that the children of Israel basically went evil and did evil in the sight of the Lord for 8 years, and then God raised up the first judge. So this is after Joshua died, because Joshua was the leader of the land that whole time. Joshua died at age 110. So if the 450 years doesn't start until the first judge arrives, because that's when, according to the scripture I just read, the judging of the nation of Israel began. This has to be about 7 or 8 years after the death of Joshua, because Joshua was reigning in the land before then. So if Joshua was 110 at the time that he died, how old was he at the time that they came out of and attacked Jericho? Well, Joshua was 60 years old at the time they attacked Jericho. He was 20 years old at the time of the Exodus, and he spent 40 years in the wilderness. He was the only 20-year-old of that whole generation, besides Caleb, that was allowed to enter the land because he was faithful in the spying of Israel. So the time period, if we go back, we'll add 7 years before the first judge arose. Then we'll add another 50 years, so we got for the time of Joshua from Jericho until his death. So now we got 57 years. And then if we add 393 years to that, we go back to the start of the affliction. You have 393 years from the affliction to the time that they enter the land of Canaan. You have another 60 years for the time that Joshua ruled, and then you have 7 years until the time that the first judge started, which gives us a total of 450 years. And that's what that verse talks about. It goes up to the time that the judges started in the book of Judges, which is exactly 450 years after the time of affliction. So we can see all 3 of these verses now coincide, and that there is no contradiction in the Bible. So now we know the answer of how long the Israelites were in bondage in Egypt. Now, I can go into this a lot further, in such as telling you what dates those would actually be, which pharaohs ruled during that time, and the actual year BC that all this happened. Just to give you a clue, the Exodus happened about 1400 BC. And you can take the rest of the dates and figure it out from there. But I've got other videos that'll go into that, and they'll be coming up in the future. But hopefully now you can clearly see that the Word of God does not contradict itself, even though it would seem to. But when you actually get into the Scriptures and you really dig into it, you'll find out that the Word of God is actually perfect and perfectly describes exactly what happened during that time period. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, if you want to see other videos like this and delve into the Scriptures, you can go to grailofTruth.com, GrailOftruth.com, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Thanks very much.